Welcome to another episode of On Air with Phoenician Hunter and the newly branded 369 Lumineer. Welcome, Phoenician Hunter.
Welcome. Good to be back.
Good to have you as always. I thoroughly enjoy these chats. So, look, today we're going to dive into what I consider would probably be one of your more controversial research pieces called Why Fascism. And for our audience listening, they could go to phoenicianhunter.substack.com to read the article. And look, for good reason. I think the subject has become front and centre with all that's going on around the world post the US elections, and there's a lot particularly around government. So I would suggest to our listeners to buckle up and get ready for the ride because it's going to be a good one. So let's jump straight into podcast number 14, Why Fascism?
Well, yeah, initially we had planned to do a podcast on another article, another topic, but recent events and recent discussion on social media prompted me to bring up this discussion point because people have the wrong idea and the wrong viewpoint about what fascism actually is and what democracy is and stands for. Since Trump's election, I hear a lot of this, Alex Jones types, and Alex Jones himself, the globalists, the New World Order, we got to fight the New World Order, we need to fight the globalists, Trump is fighting the globalists, but he never actually tells you who the globalists are, right? America are the globalists. And I'll prove that in this discussion that we're going to have. So when he says, we need to put an end to the New World Order, the globalists, to me, that's saying, oh, well, you're going to put an end to America then. He's fighting themselves. Now, when I say the globalists and the New World Order, I'm not talking about the American people here, okay? Because they're victims of this just as everyone else. It's the government and the institutions that run America, the corporations, collectively make the New World Order and the globalists.
Yes.
And like I said, we'll prove that
throughout this discussion. Yeah.
Right? So I just want to bring up some points that have been recently revealed. First one is the US aid, right, has made the news, which for those who don't know, it's the United States Agency for International Development, all right? So it's one of the largest official aid agencies in the world with a budget over 40 billion. And I mean, it's the highest in the world. No other country comes close, all right? And they're active in over 100 countries. Now, what are they doing there? Now, this has been revealed with the Trump administration, and Trump has just announced that he's freezing all funding of this agency. Now, this is what they've been doing. Promoting funding LGBT, DEI, which is diversity, equality, and inclusion. Sponsoring foreign media and journalists to change the narrative to suit what America wants. Liberal left political parties throughout Europe. I mean, all these parties, the right-wing parties, populist parties that are trying to take power in Europe because the people of Europe are unhappy with what's going on. America is funding the opposition, so they're funding the lefty parties, right? So another one is financing NGOs, immigration into Europe and the rest of the world. Why? They're trying to destroy the culture and genetic makeup of these nations. So I hear a lot of Americans, conservative and right-wing Americans, they're fighting against all this stuff. They're fighting against LGBT, diversity, equality, immigration, but you're fighting your own empire. You are the source of this stuff. It's coming from UK and America.
I want to add to that, just so our listeners don't think that, you're making it up, that this is what USA AID is doing. But I want to entertain our audience just to tell them where some of this funding and how much of this funding has gone through. So this will take me literally 30 seconds. So $8.5 billion to Chemonics, which is a privately held company. Check this out, focusing on international development projects aimed at improving lives around the world. Okay, whatever.
Yeah, it means nothing.
Means nothing, right? $1.5 million to DEI program in Serbia. 400,000 for a podcast on gender equality in Latin America. Yeah. $2.5 million for electrical vehicle charges in Vietnam. $6 million to Egypt's Tourism Commission. $2 million. Again, this is to your point, 2 million for sex reassignment and LGBTQ plus activism in Guatemala, 32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru,
destroying the culture of those places. Okay.
40, I'll continue because it's near, and
Yep.
this is only just a small portion. 47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia, 37 million to the WHO. Yeah, we know what that's for. 16 million for gender development officers in the US.
Yeah,
3 million.
obviously very important. All these issues are very important to developing
Yep,
worlds.
3 million for an LGBTQ plus rights and inclusivity project in Uganda. And here's the piece de resistance: 5 million to Sean Penn to meet with Zelensky, and 4 million to Ben Stiller to do the same and show him his Oscar. So I just wanted to put a reference to that, which justifies what you've just said.
So a lot of good Americans, who also follow this podcast, and they're on board with fighting against this what we call liberal left ideology, right? But what they need to realize, it's coming from your home, it's coming from your base, it's coming from your own government.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Trump says, or the Trump administration says, they're going to put a freeze to it. And for those who haven't listened to our earlier podcast on Trump, we did one just after the Trump election, and I said then that it's either going to be revolution or business as usual. So time will tell. So now this to me is an indication that maybe things are going to change, because he's putting a freeze on the funding, and I think he's actually just put a stop to the whole agency as far as
Yeah, well, they were taking down the signage on the building only yesterday.
Yeah.
So
yeah. But I just wanted to illustrate how toxic this agency has been around the world, and preventing right-wing or populist parties taking office, because all the funding is going to their opposition. So, this is why I say that America and the UK are the global empire. Okay. So what I also wanted to point out, that this global empire, I believe, is made up of what they call the Anglosphere. There's another term for it, which is the Five Eyes, the Five Eyes Alliance or nations, which comprises Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and the United States. Now, people say, oh, what about Israel? So now Israel has sort of, I feel, a kind of special relationship where when they feel like it, they're a part of it. And when it doesn't suit them, they're not a part of it. Do you know what I mean? So they're in and they're not. It's a Judaic Anglo-American empire. Okay, they are part of it.
And I think a lot of the media that's coming out, particularly around social media, is that's being brought to light. So you're on track there.
Yeah, that's all I wanted to say there. So, back to the article. Okay, so this article that I wrote, Why Fascism, subtitled, The Concept is a Spiritual One, which is very important. Now, this has always been available for free on my Substack, because I feel it's very important. And all my work sort of revolves around this subject matter. So one of the reasons I got into this whole blog idea, my book, everything I've written, I looked at the world we live in and I thought, okay, so the environment we live in is a reflection of us. So your personal environment is a reflection of you and your mind. And the same, if you extend that to the world, the same thing. Okay, so the world is a reflection of the people in it and their thoughts and their ideas. Okay, so when I look at the world, I think, what is it? It's almost like a commercial enterprise. Everything is for sale. It's just business. So now, who would have created the world like that? Who does that world suit? Who profits from it the most? And that's why I came up with the merchants. And this is why I'm called the Phoenician hunter. Phoenician is just merchants. It means merchants, okay? Or merchants, bankers, traders, whatever you want to call it. And I'm hunting them. I want to find out who these people are and how they created this construct that we call the living world. So it's a reflection of them, their mind, okay? We just go along with it. Now, why fascism is because fascism is the only system of government, especially in the modern era, that has challenged that concept. They're the only ones who have challenged the material concept of governance. Okay.
Can I interject for a moment?
Yeah.
So, it goes without saying that your subscribers and our listening audience are a very intelligent and well-informed group. But before we continue, it's probably best if we define fascism so we're all on the same page. So I guess the most well-known fascist would be Benito Mussolini. During the Second World War, and his definition was, it's an extension of a quote. It basically goes, the conception is therefore a spiritual one, arising from the general reaction of the century against the materialistic positivism of the 19th century. Okay, pretty straightforward. We understand where he stands. But what is positivism? It's defined as a philosophical system which recognizes only that which can be scientifically verified or which is capable of logical or mathematical proof, and therefore rejecting metaphysics and theism.
Okay, so what he's saying is that they're not rejecting metaphysics, they're not rejecting a spiritual purpose, right? Whereas communism, capitalism is based on material gain, improving your life through materialism. And everything has to be scientifically proven and verified and logical. And that's the world we live in. It's almost like anything spiritual is like pseudoscience, anything metaphysics. If you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't prove it, Okay, so that's what he's trying to say there. And that's what most people do not understand that about fascism. And it's not their fault because we've been taught that fascism equals bad. Okay.
Yes.
So as a consequence of decades of propaganda by the media, this is what we've been taught. And remember, the winners write history. All right. So you got to think about who controls mainstream media. Look into publishing and who controls publishing, film. And we all know film, Hollywood.
Yes.
The winners of World War II wrote our history. And that's why everything about fascism it has to be bad. Now, have you noticed that the same thing does not extend to communism? How many films have we seen of communist atrocities? None. Now, this is important because communism is not seen as a threat to these people.
Yeah.
And I'll explain why later. Only fascism is because, like I said, capitalism, democracy, and communism, their purpose is for materialistic growth, not spiritual growth. And that's the point of difference with fascism.
Can I just say that I've got a question, right? And which I'm asked quite often when I'm having discussions with people and comments on social media. Who are, what you call the globalists or elites who rule over us? Now, I can be conspiratorial and give you my thoughts, but I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, well, don't ask Alex Jones because...
No, of course not.
Okay, so this is easy to find out because, who kicks and screams the loudest? The one thing that they hate the most is fascism. So why would they hate it? Because they fear it. They fear it so much because they know it will destroy them. If people knew the truth of that system and that ideology, that's why they fear it. And that's why it has to be constantly bashed. And the people who rule over us, like I say, are merchants.
Yep.
Because the world we live in is a reflection of the people who rule it. If you build a house, you're going to build a house the way you want it. It's you're the owner. So that's what they've done. So they're merchants. And now these merchants are not all of the one race. Okay. This is the other thing.
Understood.
Okay. People need to understand that. At the moment, the ones who rule and have ruled since World War II, like I said, it's an Anglo-American Jewish group.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
You can break that down further and go into, all right, their family lines and I've traced them back on my Substack. I've got many articles about this. They moved from Venice, Amsterdam, England to America. And, I could even go further back than that.
We've touched on these points.
We've touched on it. And it's not important anyway.
It's not. But what I want to, and just to support what you've just said, the definition of globalism as far as, the online etymology dictionary defines it, is a worldwide extension of capitalist market systems.
Exactly. Now, we look at that phrase. Now, so who dominates the global markets? US corporations dominate the world global markets, okay? Stock markets. Today, the world's largest investment companies are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, which I've written about in an article on my Substack. These are all US corporations. Now, these three firms alone are major shareholders in 95% of the S&P 500 companies, so which are the 500 largest companies in the world. 95%. So
that's
they
crazy.
own all of them.
That's crazy.
Okay, so it's US corporations. So what people need to understand is we started historically with city-states, we moved to larger states, to nations, and now we're in the era of corporations, but they're still US-based, okay?
Yes. And more people are talking about it on social media. TikTok obviously is, TikTok news, they call it. All this is coming out. But what I want to know is, how did you get to this point? As far as a timeline is concerned, how did you get to the point of merchants to US corporations?
You trace their activities. It's like, don't look at people and don't look at names, just look at behavior. By their fruits you shall know them. What is their behavior? And their behavior doesn't change throughout history. So you can trace them. So if you start from today and work back, it's like, all right, so how did America get powerful? Globalism is the evolution of the British Empire, or more specifically, the British East India Company. Okay.
Which you've mentioned before, yeah.
Yeah, which I've mentioned before. And the British East India Company was founded in the City of London. And their main shareholders were the livery companies of the City of London, which I've spoken about before.
Yes, yes.
The nations have become corporations,
Okay. Following on from that, I'd like to direct you to a quote in your article, which I would really like your thoughts on if you probably allow me to read this. You state this: I don't think we'd have a globalist capitalist economy, a global rather capitalist economic system that looks the way it does if England hadn't become so uniquely powerful at this point in history. They transitioned into a modern industrial force and exported their vision of production and governance to the rest of the world, including North America. It's the cornerstone of the modern liberal global political order. Can you explain this, please?
Well, yeah, I mean, this quote is from an author who studied the British East India Company and the way they conducted trade and commerce. She identified that as the starting point of the modern liberal political order. And I agree with her. That's the point where we transitioned from the old way of doing things to the modern way of doing things. And like she says, it was transplanted into North America by the British. She's just identifying there again that it's a British and American system.
Okay, which qualifies your comments earlier.
Yeah, which we need to understand is liberal democracy that the West has adopted and most countries around the world is a British system. Now, people equate this with freedom. Okay, I live in a liberal democracy. That means I'm free. You're not free, okay? You're as free as the government allows you to be, okay? Let's see. Let's remember during COVID, okay? Now let's talk about Australia. Liberal democracy. How free were these people during the COVID
lockdown
epidemic?
The worst lockdown in the world.
Yeah, the longest continuous lockdown in the world was the state of Victoria, and I think second was New South Wales. Okay. And now this footage, and I've seen people being beaten, arrested, jailed. Now I remember there was a few cases of people who spoke out on social media, YouTube, about what was happening in Australia and the government. These people were jailed. Okay.
Yeah, it was the classic one on Facebook that a young pregnant mother in Geelong that was, had the police and the feds rock up to take her away, literally handcuff her and take her away.
Yeah, but she was soon released. I'm talking about ones that were kept in there for close to a year that we don't hear about. Now, if that happened in China, for instance, what would people say? Oh, it's a communist. That lucky I don't live in communism. But when it happens in a liberal democracy, this is the first thing people say. Oh, the government's become communist or it's become fascist. No, it hasn't become communist. It hasn't become fascist. It's democracy. And that's how democracy has always run. It's just that you haven't, in your short lifetime, haven't come across it because nothing's happened. The government hasn't been forced to implement these rules in your lifetime. But trust me, when it calls for it, they will implement it. Now, coming from someone who's lived in Australia, the government rules with an iron fist. You can't do anything without getting a fine, okay?
Yes, that's right.
And talking to a police officer in Australia police officers, I don't think are human in that part of the world, okay? You can't have a conversation with them. I don't know what your experience has been with police officers, but I think they're disgusting. And I've lived in a few countries around the world, and none of them come close to their behaviour and their arrogance, and they just look down upon people. It's almost like they're a separate class of people.
Well, look, there have been some major issues that have affected police forces throughout Australia since the 80s, from corruption, and I'm talking deep corruption in Queensland, in New South Wales, and particularly in Victoria. And there are a lot of factual stories and court cases that are coming out where people are taking the Victoria Police to court and winning because of their, the way they act.
Brutality.
I can recount countless stories during lockdown, because I know that you weren't there, but I was in Melbourne during lockdown at COVID, and I can recount countless stories of people being gang tackled to the ground, innocent dads walking their kids, people being gang tackled because they weren't wearing a mask or because they had something to say. It even happened. It even happened to my son.
Yeah, but I mean, I've known of these things happening even before COVID. Like I have personal, people in my life that have had these things happen to them. Property confiscated, beaten. They're just corrupt.
Yes,
and disgusting. Okay.
So how does this tie into, say, free speech laws, for example?
So one of the recent things that prompted this discussion was the new laws passed in Australia, and I believe it started in the UK with hate speech laws, and everyone's saying, yeah, like I said, saying that the government's turned fascist. And what I want to highlight is that Australia, for instance, and I know this is the same with Canada and the UK, have always been anti-speech laws. Anti-speech if it's not government approved. And I'll give you some examples. Lawrence Southern and Stephen Molyneux were touring Australia and New Zealand back in 2018, I believe. And they both had difficulty getting into Australia and New Zealand. Actually, Stephen Molyneux was banned from entering New Zealand. This is in 2018. So this is pre-COVID, pre all this crazy stuff. And I know the same thing happened with David Icke. He was banned from Australia in 2019. And
you had Milan Ray in 2004, Brendan O'Connell in 2010, Tommy Robinson in 2018.
That's right.
Zakir Naik in 2017. These are all that have had their visas cancelled entering Australia.
This isn't new. What people need to understand is your government, it's nothing new. They've always done this. Liberal democracy has always done this. It's no different to, a communist state or a fascist state jailing, anti-government protesters. It's no different. It happens under democracy as well. It's always happened. If you look at history in those countries, it's always happened. And the Pillar of Freedom, America, it's happened there too. Don't think, you just said, look at Ezra Pound. He was banned. He was put in an asylum when he was brought to America. Another author, Francis Parker Yockey, who wrote a brilliant book called Imperium in 1948. He was killed. People, the official explanation is he committed suicide, but he was killed under FBI custody. If you speak up against your government, democratic liberal government, it's no different to being in a fascist state or a communist state. You speak up against all systems of government do this, okay? If they feel that their system is under threat, they're going to come down on you. So different, better off in a democracy than any of the others in that regards of freedom of speech.
So why do you think that, particularly in countries like Australia, hate speech laws are being implemented now? I guess it has something to do with immigration.
Well, yeah, because it's happened. Okay, there's two things. People protesting against the Israeli genocide in Gaza. That has prompted, hate speech laws, even in America, anti-Semitism laws. Well, I think it's a bill, but it hasn't passed as a law. But they're threatening to do that. So that's one reason. So people outspoken against the Israeli government and the events there, and also people are upset or are noticing that their countries are being flooded with immigrants, right? So the racial makeup of the countries is now noticeable. So there's dissent growing, and there's also a growing nationalism or ethnic identity growing, especially in Australia, Canada, America. Now, like I said earlier, that is a threat to democracy. Nationalism is a threat to democracy. And we'll get into why that in a few moments. Yeah, people have noticed that the countries are getting invaded, so they will need to stop that. So that's why these are being implemented now.
Well, funny you should say that, because recently, and I'm talking this week, the Australian government has amended their hate speech law bill, and this is in fine writing, to include, and if you can't see the fine writing, then you will miss this, any ethnically originated speech. Now, that's very broad in its description, but we know what that means.
So I just want to point out that this whole thinking is the British model. It's a British policy, and this is their thinking, and this is their ideology that has been spread across the world.
Funny you should say that, because I want to quote from your article, and I want your interpretation of this. So the quote goes, "Britain is the workshop of the world. It lives by foreign trade. Therefore, to secure and hold markets, it must invest money abroad, acquire colonies, and control the seas. The world must be made safe, not for democracy, for that is only a word, but for trade and commerce. That is the national policy of the British people, of both Liberals and Conservatives. It forms the background of all British thinking."
Yeah, I mean, that sums up everything perfectly.
So can you maybe interpret?
Yeah, there's a few things in there. No, first of all, that they're traders, merchants, okay? That's how they make their living. and they need to secure and hold markets abroad as well. It's not a national policy, it's a global policy, right? They need to
Colonialism.
control, globalism. They need to control the seas. That's why Britain, and by extension now America, have always had a strong navy, the strongest navy in the world, okay? And again, not for democracy, because that is just a word, for trade and commerce, all right? See, now democracy is just another word for internationalism. Okay, that's what it means. And this is the national policy of the British people. And there's no difference between both parties that run.
That's right.
That's why all Commonwealth British colonies and British government have two main parties. Okay, that's why, two-party system.
The Westminster system as we know it.
Yeah, exactly. And America has adopted that. You've got a two-party system. There's no way you can form a party and take government in a lifetime. Okay, now that's not the case in Europe. For instance, Fratelli d'Italia, that are in power now, a few years ago had, I think, 2% of the vote, 3%.
That's Giorgia Meloni's party.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now recent polling have them at 50%. That could never happen in America or any of the English-speaking nations because of this system that they've implemented. And they've done that on purpose. So, this system also is because it gives the merchant class, this international merchant class, or financial oligarchy is another term, it gives them control of the nation's wealth. Okay, so they don't really care of the welfare of the people, and this is noted now. So now this another thing I want to bring up is, in the past, these merchants relied on the patriotic people to go to war for them when they needed to. We're reaching an era where manpower is not really needed, I don't think. Okay, because now you've got different ways of conducting warfare. Okay,
Drones.
Yeah, we're getting into that. Bombs. You don't need as many, manpower. You don't need it. So maybe that is probably why now the people are being replaced. They don't need an armed force. And they probably can hire mercenaries too if they need manpower. They've done that in the past as well. Yeah, I think they're moving away from that.
Well, didn't, and I very much dislike this individual, but didn't Henry Kissinger's, one of his famous quotes was, I think it goes along something like, I'm sorry if I'm misquoting, but America had a mission to bring about democracy, if necessary, by use of force.
Yeah.
Geez.
They need to force it. You think the way they promote, loving liberal democracy, freedoms, everyone will just want it. You don't need to force it. I mean, see, people need to understand that the British Empire achieved global dominance and its position not through flowers and love and compromise and understanding. It was through violence, conflict, and conquest. And if they didn't do it, someone else probably would have done it. The French or whatever. I'm not blaming them for doing it, but that's how they did it.
Sure.
So don't come and tell me that democracy, is this loving, peaceful, freedom form of government. It's not. It got to power through violence. So, when people say, fascism or Hitler wanted to take over the world, they wanted to take over the world. And if it wasn't for us to stop them, they would have taken over the world. No, the British and Americans have done the same. They're no different. They're no better. They're no worse. They've done exactly the same as you're claiming that, the fascists would have done. And, America hasn't stopped expanding since the Spanish-American War.
Yeah.
In the late 1800s. And, and they're still doing it today.
And it's okay when they do it, I suppose.
Yeah, it's okay when they do it.
Exactly. In their minds. Well, again, you mentioned Oswald Mosley, Sir Oswald Mosley. He was a British politician, just for our audience. He was also a fascist leader during the 20s and 30s. And anyone that's probably seen Peaky Blinders, which is a magnificent series if you haven't, he was portrayed as the leader of the BUF, or the British Union of Fascist. So he was heavy in the parliament. So this is what he said. Fascism is the system by which the nation uses capital for its own purposes. Private enterprise is permitted and encouraged so long as it coincides with the national interests. Private enterprise is not permitted when it conflicts with national interests. Under fascism, private enterprise may serve but not exploit.
Oswald Mosley, I encourage everyone to read his books. He's got a lot of literature out there, and I quote him extensively in the article. We're not going to do that now, but, like I said, the article is free. for those who are interested.
PhoenicianHunter.substack.com for anyone
Yeah.
wanting to do that.
Because again, it's an important piece and, sort of like almost a cornerstone of the story I'm trying to tell and why I'm trying to tell it.
Sure.
So, and it brings it up right, a lot of my stuff's, based in ancient history, but this brings it right up to till today and what's affecting us today in the modern world.
Explain his quote, which, if you know about Mosley,
Yeah, well,
you
see,
know about this.
yeah, this is another myth that people claim about fascism that, the government runs everything. You can't have private enterprise, you can't have a private business. That's not true. You can, and like you said there, but it can't conflict with the national interest. So, for instance, you can't have a corporation or a business and employ all foreigners, because that does not benefit the people of that nation, does it? The jobs should go to the people of that place. All the profits, they're not in the hands of a foreigner who's never stepped foot in that country, who doesn't care. Another important piece. Just think about that and that quote that you read out. And that, to me, most people complaining about their situation today, about can't find work, or work's being given to foreigners, or we hear this daily, especially in Canada recently, in Australia, and housing, they can't afford housing because it goes to foreigners, or they get priority over jobs and on healthcare even. That would not exist under this system. The thing is that these people in their own countries, like, say, for instance, in India or China, their own people are catered for first. It's only in the Western countries, the so-called democracies, that for some reason foreigners are put first and citizens are put last, in the pecking order. I mean, and this quote is from the 1930s. I mean,
That's right.
there's nothing new. They knew about this back then. The problems we're facing today existed before, okay? They tried to put a stop to it, but they lost, okay? So, that's why we live under the system we do. And also another quote by Oswald Mosley is, fascism will not tolerate the growing monopoly of people's vital supplies in alien hands. Again, so your companies, your institutions, your facilities, your resources are not in the hands of foreigners, there to exploit the nation. Really, what we've set up here is to prove that democracy is the international merchant's favored system of governance, because it places control of the nation's economy and resources in foreign hands. So they don't have to be in your nation in order to control you. They can control you from afar. Nationalism puts a stop to that. You can't do that. Now, Elon Musk is another one I hear constantly going on about declining population rants. The reason he pushes that agenda is because their economic model is based on growth. So you got to have constant growth for their system to maintain the wealth and for it to keep going, ticking over. They need growth, constant growth. There's nothing wrong with smaller populations. You can see in Europe, we're overpopulated. Even Australia, where you've got an abundance of land, most of that is not usable. Okay, and most people live in two cities
Along the eastern seaboard. Yeah.
You look at past empires; they were great with smaller populations. You don't need these large populations just consuming. This is what they want you to consume. Buy more houses, buy more furniture, goods, or whatever. Everything. It's just consume. This is what he represents. This is why they push that, and that's why they're pushing immigrants into these nations as well. That's another reason.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate here and say, why do you think that communism, for example, isn't condemned in the same way?
Yeah, we touched on that briefly, but we'll get into it here. I mean, communism, another word for communism is internationalism. And really that's what it was known as before, the word communism started gaining ground. For instance, one of the first communist associations was called the First International. That's what they were called. By the way, that meeting, the First International, was held where? In the city of
Let
London.
me guess. Yeah, there you go.
So, the merchants are pushing that agenda there. And, that was the first, they say, the first recorded appearance of, Karl Marx in one of these communist associations or fraternities or whatever, right? So now I'll just touch on this, but I'll get into this in the article in more depth. So communism relies on foreign trade and finance as well, just as capitalism does. And it borrows from, it doesn't have a problem from borrowing from international banks. Now, I believe China is slightly different. They have state-owned central banks. China changed it a bit. They've made it slightly more nationalistic. And, you look at China, it doesn't really operate like the old Soviet Union or the ideals of Karl Marx or some of those early communist theologians. It has a nationalistic underbelly to its system, and that was one of them. So communism, it borrows from international banks and finance houses, okay?
Right.
So something that would be against that system was what Hitler was trying to implement. He wanted to not borrow money from international banks. And people point to this as one of the reasons why, Germany had to be invaded and stopped, right? Because he wanted to print his own money, basically. And Abraham Lincoln did this too. So, America has a history of printing their own money. And, they also say that was one of the reasons the Federal Reserve had to be implemented. Abraham Lincoln's greenbacks were very successful, and this, bothered the international bankers.
Didn't Gaddafi in Libya try to do that? And then, do you want to maybe talk about that at all?
Well, I've heard that. You probably know more about it.
Yeah, well, he wanted to do the same thing. He wanted to bring Africa together as a nation and start trading in African currency. And then, the media, as we know, who owns the media, started the narrative that he was a bad man and he had to be rid of. And sure enough, they got rid of him. And look at Libya now to what it was while Gaddafi was in power. Can I just say, when Gaddafi was in power, their citizens had free healthcare, free education, free housing. If you want to get married, the government would give you a $5,000 gift, etc. Now it is in a state of disrepair.
Yeah, and that's because of democracy.
That's right.
And another thing that I noticed that all democracies, so America, all the nations that we've mentioned, you're allowed to form a communist party, okay? So they allow that. It's not a threat to them. Like I said earlier, it's not a threat because international trade is still allowed. No country is allowed a real fascist party, okay?
Interesting.
If you go online today, you'll see the government of Italy, they're called Fratelli d'Italia. People say, oh, they're fascist, they're right-wing. No, they're not fascist, okay? They're right-wing, but they're not fascist. Like I said, they're right-wing, but they're still open to foreign investment. They're still open to foreign trade. That's not fascism, okay, people? Yeah. So when they say they're fascist, they're not fascist, okay? They're right-wing.
So what you're basically saying regarding the merchants, like what conditions have they created?
Okay. I was looking at the current conditions on the world, and what is it? To me, it's a material world, right? That's what drives people. That's what drives the world, this consumerism.
And materialism, again, by definition, is someone that it's a tendency to consider material possessions and physical comfort as more important than spiritual values.
Exactly. Yeah, important. See, now this is an important point because capitalist democracy, socialism and communism share one important characteristic, and that is they stand divided on certain issues. But like I said, all right, foreign trade is encouraged. But one other important thing is what their principal focus is on improving the economic conditions of man above all else. Okay, so material needs. So, you hear socialists saying, oh, they need housing, they need benefits to live, food and yes, okay. So they're looking at what? The material needs, the economic conditions of man. He needs all these goods and services. But what they neglect, what all these things neglect is cultural, moral, and spiritual matters.
Of course.
They don't focus on those. They don't care, right? And that's why a lot of communists are atheists as well. Yep. They're interested in the material gains, not any kind of spiritual development. So, and fascism is the only one, like I said, is the only system that takes the opposite approach. And it recognizes that man is first a spiritual being. That's what we are first. And they require more than material comforts and desires for an easy life. This is why you see in the modern world, in the wealthiest countries like America, Australia, they've got the highest rates of depression. Yeah. Right? So wealth does not equal, material wealth does not equal happiness.
Correct. Okay. And look, we should maybe make a point that we're by no means promoting any particular ideology here. Your article is about fascism, and we talk about fascism. So, we're not doing pros and cons of one over the other. But I wanted to also bring in another quote by Benito Mussolini.
Before you bring that quote,
please.
You make a good point, and there are problems with fascism too that I have personally. So no system is perfect, but the way we're heading currently, we're heading for disaster, and the system needs to change. And I believe a move towards a spiritual existence is the answer. Okay. Now there are people who do that individually, but no one's doing it collectively. There's no nation, one nation or one state that is doing it, that everyone together united are doing it. Now that's where you need a central government to help do that. And that's where, the government of, for instance, fascism, that's their principal ideology, and that's where they will help implement that.
Can we
So
look at any governments around the world that are doing that, or none at all?
no,
It just doesn't
no,
exist.
none.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Can I just point out a quote from Mussolini again, which you raise? Fascism denies the materialistic conception of happiness as a possibility. This means that fascism denies the equation well-being equals happiness, which sees in men mere animals, content when they can feed and fatten, thus reducing them to a vegetative existence, pure and simple.
So that really just explains what I just mentioned a moment ago.
Yep.
That is in their doctrine, and it's the only, like I said, it's the only form of modern governance that has that doctrine in there. That everyone else is concerned, like I said, with trade, materialism, wealth, the economic conditions of man to improve, and that's important too, right? To a certain level, socialism to a certain extent has helped. People were living in very poor conditions in what we called, the Western world up until very recently. So socialism's helped, but it has stopped there. It hasn't looked at the other things that we need, which is, spiritual happiness, existence, development, a sense of belonging. I mean, places like Australia, I keep bringing up Australia because that's where I grew up. No one feels part of anything there. You don't
That's
feel like
right.
you belong to anything. There's no unity there.
And I'd like to focus on that because, as people will obviously know by our accents, we're both from Australia, and I think this is very, very important to both of us. But can I just close that quote from Mussolini, which I guess it ties into what you've just said. He continues by saying, thus many of the practical expressions of fascism, such as party organisation, system of education and discipline, can only be understood when considered in relation to its general attitude towards life, a spiritual attitude.
That doctrine is constantly, pushing this spiritual. We need to go towards a spiritual path, and that's what's missing.
History will. Mussolini's legacy is that he was a dictator and complicit in all the bad things that happened during the Second World War. That's what he'll go down as.
No, he won't. That will change.
Well,
And I'll say the same for Hitler. Like, I mean, I read that, during his time and just after, Napoleon was despised, even by the French themselves. It's taken a couple of hundred years for that to mend, and now he's glorified. The French love him. And I believe the same thing will happen to these people. Nothing lasts forever, nothing. Truth will come out because, like I said, they control the narrative now.
Yes.
People are already asking questions. I mean, I've seen stuff on social media and in discussions that wouldn't have been raised 20 years ago. People are trying to tell me stuff that I go, I was thinking that, 40 years ago.
Yeah. You touched on Australia and why you want to say why you left Australia, maybe, and this is
well, these places that are under this Anglosphere, I view them as an economic zone because there's more to a country than just putting a bunch of people together from all different places and races and saying, here you go, here's your flag, these are your colors, this is your spoken language, and there you go, you're a country. No, there's more to it than that. That was the reason I left. I didn't feel any pull to anything that was being sold to me there. So that's why I went back to my roots, which were Europe. And I hear these discussions from people in Australia on social media saying, I'm not happy here. Where do I go? And these are European people, right? White people. And then they say, I went to Thailand, I'm living in Bali, or I'm living in the Philippines, I'm happy. And it's just like, so obviously cultural links and ties and that kind of thing has no importance to you because you can go to from one foreign country to another foreign country. I've never understood that. Like, what are these people looking for? What makes them happy? Just having the government off their back and being able to. And one of the key points is, cost of living is cheaper. That's it. So it goes back to material. What can I gain materially?
Sure.
we've got to look beyond that. We've got to look at our souls. Where do we belong, and spiritual development. And another point I want to raise about fascism is that it's a modern system, but a lot of its thinkers, intellectuals like Julius Evola, Simitri Devi was another, that they look to the East for inspiration. So there's this idea that a lot of the fascist doctrine existed in Eastern or Oriental or Indian philosophy, and that's why fascists and even the National Socialists of Germany were obsessed with that region. People probably are not aware that, the Germans were all over Tibet, translating old Tibetan literature. And so a lot of this ideology comes from the East. So it was born there. And they say at one time it was practiced there. In India, lived under a similar system to fascism. How much, I don't know. How much of the modern version took from there, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Well, look, it's certainly raised a number of issues, the discussion that we've just had. And again, I just want to reiterate that, we're not pushing one ideology over another. I found your article fascinating, which is why I'm happy that we've had this discussion. I think we can talk about a lot of other parts of your article in another podcast if we need to, and maybe get into aspects of spirituality if we think that's going to add value. And if it doesn't, if it detracts, then we don't do it, obviously. But we're nearing the end of yet another insightful podcast. What are your final thoughts?
I encourage everyone to read it. Like I said, it's free. It's going to be free because of its importance. And all I'm advocating is that the current system benefits the merchant class, this international merchant class. So if we keep saying democracy is okay, internationalism is okay, you're just going to get more of the same thing. They're not going to stop. They're not going to push you towards a spiritual path. Like I said, unless you go there individually, but we need more people doing this. Like I said, there's no nation doing it. There's no states. And then again, spiritual is, and then that word has become corrupted as well. It's like it's become organized religion. I say is another product of the merchant class, and I've got many articles on that as well. Organized religion is a product of the merchant class. Okay, you got to look beyond those doctrines. Difficult conversation to have. It's difficult.
Oh, of course it is. And, even more so, I would even encourage people to go and dig a little deeper into Mussolini and Hitler and what they stood for. Again, we're not advocating or we're not condoning that what happened or what we're told has happened was right, but just to dig deeper into different ideologies.
Yeah, what we're told happened is probably the accurate phrase there, because a lot that's been attributed to them is debatable. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well,
I don't believe it occurred the way they say anyway.
And I agree with you because of the vast amount of reading and research that we've done. But Napoleon, I think, put it best, or at least this quote is attributed to Napoleon, is that history is a set of lies agreed upon.
Exactly.
And that's how the narrative has formed. Well, look, I have to say this has been one of my leading favourite chats that we've had. So thanks again for your time. I encourage people to visit and subscribe to your Substack, which is at phoenicianhunter.substack.com. They can listen to this podcast and many more at youtube.com/@369 Lumineer. We'll have all the details, and I look forward to, again, our next chat.
Thank you. Till next week.
Till next week. Stay well.